The Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Yeah, tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to this new episode of A View from Afar. And today, political scientist Paul Buchanan and I are going to analyse what we're referring to as the era of restive politics. In particular, Paul and I will explore the political dynamics between the United States of America, the United Kingdom, the People's Republic of China, Italy and Brazil. And within this context, we will examine the threads of social and political change that's sweeping the world and what this means as we approach the end of 2022. So we're about to cross to Paul, but before we do feel free to interact with us while live, and you can do so by joining the YouTube feed or Facebook. But do remember, if you make comments or lodge questions, your interaction may be included in this broadcast. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. It's a great topic. We've got Paul waiting, so let's cross to him, who's waiting online to unpack all of this. Kia ora koutou, Paul. How are you doing? Tēnā koe e ho.
Kia ora, Selwyn. It's great to be back. You're looking fit, healthy.
Yeah.
Can't get better than that. I'm looking a little pale, but maybe it's the lighting.
I can send some makeup down to you, Paul, and some lipstick, but I don't know if it'll do too well for your reputation if it did that.
As I say, I got a face made for radio, so.
Yeah, I'm often the same. I've just, for those that are tuning in and tuning in at the moment, I've just had a change in location, so there's a bit more sun than what we're used to. So if I look a little bit ruddy on it, we'll try and tune these lights down for the next episode.
No,
but Paul, this is a fantastic topic, and I appreciate you introducing me to some of the nuance that threads through all of this, and I'd like to get this going and share it with the audience. In particular, can you the key once again here is the title, isn't it? The era of restive politics. Paul, can you define restive for us within this context and single that out so that people have a foundation as we go forward?
Yeah, I will. What I'd like to do, though, is I'll tell you how I came to thinking about the era of restive politics. You and I have talked about the move to multipolarity, the long transition from the bipolar world to the world where, the multipolar world that's emerging now. I mean, this is our moment. And we've also talked about the crisis of governability. Remember we had that conversation about Lebanon.
Yes.
And, that the silo explosion and whatnot was an example of absolutely abysmal governance, but it wasn't just Lebanon. And then the pandemic has hit, and the incompetence of certain countries in managing the pandemic, the United States being the poster child, got me to thinking, if you combine the two as backdrop, what you get is a crisis of internal governance with the shift to multipolarity, which among other things results in norm erosion, rules violations. The world is clearly changing. And that got me to thinking, what is the common denominator between most polities in the world today, whether or not they are governed by authoritarians or Democrats? And I'll get to this as we go through our list of countries. And I realize what it is disgruntlement, that the public in a variety of regimes is dissatisfied, is resentful, is frustrated, all of which is magnified by modern telecommunications and social media and whatnot. It's very hard now for even authoritarians to completely censor expressions of discontent. And again, I'll
So
talk
what,
about.
so all this is different to ideology, that as a cloak that constrains the politics within a particular country. And it seems like what you're describing there also is that it may be global. The problems, like we know, the economies, every domestic economy is adjusting to the global economy challenges. We just in mentioning that. But the population is domestic focused in its dissatisfaction, it appears. Does that be a correct thing? I'll just pass it back to you on that.
Yeah, and it's very good. I mean, what I like is that things we've been talking about over the past 2 years that we've been doing this are slowly, they're all coming together. And that the post-pandemic world is a very disgruntled world, a dissatisfied world. And lo and behold, against any notion of common sense, a lot of the leading entities in the global order want to go back to the status quo that existed prior to the pandemic. And I think we agree that the pandemic turned out to be not so much a health crisis as a crisis of late capitalism, which exacerbated the health issues. Well, I got to think, looking across, we've had a series of elections around the world. We've had some leadership changes and challenges and what have you. And I thought, that the common denominator here is that people around the world, regardless of regime or ideology, very good point, are just dissatisfied. But that dissatisfaction is no longer passive. It's not acquiescent. People are they're grumpy. That's why I was thinking restive. They're sitting there, maybe not seething, but they've had enough. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that governments are not delivering on people's expectations, and people's expectations have been elevated by the experience of others, again, generated unfiltered through social media. As much as disinformation and whatnot exists out there, people have a direct line of communication with others across the world that governments cannot censor in the measure they used to, in the sort of pre-internet days. And so there's just this sense of malaise and what have you. Now, the bad part of that is that if you're frustrated, as someone, let's say in a democracy, we'll start with that. And so, we've heard the refrain, it doesn't matter who you vote for, the politicians are all the same, they're all corrupt. And we hear this here in New Zealand, but we see it all around the world where people are like, they're all the same. Nothing ever changes. The problem there is that the public, they're frustrated, they're angry, but they can't do anything about it. Policy prescriptions that might be offered by technocrats or by political scientists are too complex. They get into jargon and what have you, and the public just wants relief. They want effective solutions now, which of course is what authoritarians offer them. And lo and behold, who steps into the breach in times like this around the world? Populist demagogues, people who will say anything, will use scapegoating and stereotyping, dog whistling, in order to curry favor with this electorate that just wants to see something done, even though a lot of the problems may be structural. I mean, I don't think that the Rust Belt industries of North America and Europe are coming back anytime soon. And that's not a governmental issue. That's, again, a capitalist issue. So to me, restive is the sum of all those parts. People are just grumpy. and dissatisfied. And so we see it in, as I said, we'll start with the democracies. We see it we'll start with the UK. The UK is an incredible example of governmental dysfunction under the Tories. I'm not sure that Labour would necessarily do better. They couldn't do much worse. But the issue is, you look at the Tories, and now that you look at who they selected, a billionaire as their new PM, and it's like, how out of touch are the Tories? They're not responding. I mean, if they would walk outside their mansions and take a look at the British public, once the euphoria, if you will, of the Queen's funeral and all that pageantry and stuff ended, the grim reality is that the UK is in a severe social and economic crisis. Severe.
I'll just pick up on the economic elements, for example. In one of the illustrations of how dysfunctional and out of touch, in my view, Paul, the UK leadership, the Tory leadership was. They go through the process, obviously, and elect Liz Truss. Yeah. So she's gone now, of course, we know that. But when she comes through, we've got a global environment, a global economic environment that in many of the leading economies are transitioning to find their balance out of the post-COVID crisis, economic crisis, where there was government stimulus, almost Keynesian economics in a 2021, 2022 kind of version of it. And they're trying to find that balance back where the private sector comes back into playing its role in stimulus and seeing where it goes. What do? Tax cuts, not even helicopter money, or targeted helicopter money, just tax cuts to the extreme, where the public is wise to that. They know, don't they, that what that means is personal responsibility kind of ideas get elevated, and next thing you know, you're having to fork out on top of your taxes, not less taxes so much as your whatever service you want to enter into, you're starting to either get compromised services or topping it up with the user pays ideologies. And the population doesn't have that kind of wealth in this environment to be able to sustain a quality of life. So getting back, that's my little diatribe there, Paul, my little rant relating to an observation of the economies and the domestic situations that all liberal democracies and liberal economies seem to be facing. But how out of touch the leadership from a policy point of view was the United Kingdom's Tory party, the Conservative Party, when they revert back to some Milton Friedman type of experiment in 2022. Paul, I just wanted to put that there and see where you take that, and then back to your main thread.
Yeah, so I mean, to me, the selection of Liz Truss as PM was basically to reward certain factions within the Conservative Party, and as it turns out, minority factions. She was not competent to be a PM. In fact, people who had watched her career in politics said she was not competent to be a cabinet minister, remembering that she was foreign minister for a while under Boris Johnson. But she was paying back favors. And those favors were aristocratic. Those were, big money favors. And so it was completely oblivious to the plight of the UK public. Again, energy bills have risen there by 200% or even more in the last year. No exaggeration. And yet these guys are, they put her in, and she rewards them with dropping, the tax cuts and whatnot. However, the other factions in the Conservative Party understood well that this was not going to go over. The markets responded negatively. I had a former professor of mine put out a tweet, and this guy's a genius, and said, when was the last time that the markets crashed when a government offered tax relief to the rich?
Yeah, that's no surprise.
So the idea was they understood that this is not good, that, this was not, you may reward the favors, but there's much bigger issues at play. And if you can't see them, right? So
solution-based things, for example, like in every country faces that, addressing the supply chains issues, the labour force issues, those two fundamentals just in an immediate sense. If you look at the UK in a post-Brexit period. It's a no-brainer that they would have been working on those two fundamentals to actually get a stable economic platform so that domestically they can at least see in the country, what have we got to trade? Are we just going to be clicking the ticket as things went through prior to Brexit? We don't have the labour force to develop product in this country like we used to. What do we do here? But the solutions, the answers to those challenges don't seem to be in evidence. While Liz Truss is gone, I think the challenges for the new Prime Minister rely on those fundamentals, of correcting those fundamentals, addressing them through whatever means is at his disposal. But to be able to achieve gains, that's when respectability will come in. At the moment, it looks like a 1990s, 2010 type of version of revolving door prime ministers like Japan suffered all those years ago.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be honest. Sunak, he's come out and said that he remains in favor of Brexit. I think there's a problem right there. I'll leave aside his detached billionaire status. He's not a man of the people, far from it. I'm going to leave aside the fact that he's of Indian descent. In this day and age, given the demographic of the UK, it was only a matter of time before a person of color took the top role.
Yeah, that's
but
one
the
of the
guy
positives.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, but this is not a working class hero here. I mean, this guy. But my thought was this: you're not even going to reconsider Brexit, and that's because it's a Tory thing. But I'd be willing to bet you, given the consequences from that vote and what's followed, that if you were to hold another referendum today, I'm not entirely sure that the majority of the UK public would not vote to readmit them or ask for permission to be readmitted into the EU. I'm not sure. I mean, I could be wrong on this, but I think, a lot of your problems started with your separation from the European common market and the barriers that began to emerge, which, are, again, it's all your own fault. And that's compounded the deep structural issues in the UK. But for me, and germane to our question, Selwyn, it's a crisis of governance. There's the incompetence. And this then goes into the US midterm elections that we're seeing coming up in less than 2 weeks. By all objective measures, Biden's legislative agenda has gone very well. Unemployment's at the lowest rate it's been in 35, 40 years.
Strengthen the US dollar.
US dollar is getting stronger. And I notice I'm talking about domestic things. I mean, he also had a lot of work to do on the foreign side. But the key is this. By objective measures, the United States is rebounding pretty well. And yet, the Republicans are focused in on inflation. And I noticed that around the world, opposition politicians are blaming their governments for inflation. It's Biden's fault that the U.S. has an annual rate now is about 8.7, I believe. We in New Zealand, again, are doing much better, but our opposition blames the incumbent government for inflation. This is a scoundrel's way of politicking. They know that this is a global structural problem. As you mentioned, there's supply chain issues and that sort of thing. There's price gouging. OPEC just refused to release more fuel into the market, which plays into the Russians' hands. There's, a lot more going on than Joe Biden. And then they play dirty. They're now into the culture wars. They don't have the Republicans and the media that surround them, that whole ecosystem. They don't have any economic rejoinder to Biden's policies. None at all. So they go for illegal immigrants. They go for crime. There's now this outrageous dog whistling that is not just racist. I mean, the racists have come out of the woodwork. But unbelievably, we've had Trump first say that American Jews were not loyal and go off on this anti-Semitic trope.
Loyal to him. Yeah.
Loyal to him, but by inference, disloyal to the patriots, the real people Anyway, that was amazing. And it gets picked up by fools like Kanye West, but it gets picked up by GOP candidates who are uttering, again, it's all indirect and whatnot, but they're starting to, pull out these old stereotypes and scapegoats. And I think, okay, these demagogues, they've gone, the Republican Party has gone full MAGA, but it's this demagogic politics that could only occur because people are so dissatisfied with the quality of governance per se. And then when we turn to Brazil, which is another, well, I've got two more election things to talk about. In Brazil, the Jair Bolsonaro refers to himself as Trump of the tropics or Trump of the South. In some ways, he's much worse than Trump because he's not as smart as Trump in that evil sort of way, but he has the backing of a faction in the army. See, he was a major in the army before he entered politics.
So he
and
can
he has
overturn an election if he needs to, whereas Trump had.
Well, that's just it. So he's come out and he's running against the former president, Lula Ignacio da Silva, Lula for short, who was jailed briefly by Bolsonaro's cronies on corruption charges. Corruption is endemic in Brazil. So everybody takes a piece of the pie, and Lula was no worse than thousands of other Brazilian politicians before him, including Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro's incredibly corrupt. So they do a revolving chair, thing when it comes to putting people in jail for corruption. But Lula was a very effective president who lowered the illiteracy rate in Brazil from 65% down to 40% during the course of his presidency. He brought millions of people out of poverty. He did good things. And it looks like he's going to win in a runoff on October 30th, so this upcoming Sunday. But Bolsonaro has taken a page out of Trump's book, and he said, the only election that is valid is the one that I'm going to win by a landslide. God has anointed me for another term. I mean, Brazilians are very religious. A lot of different religions, but so apparently God has chosen him, and that a vote for Lula is a vote against God. It's all bad things. And he's gone down the path of scapegoating, stereotyping, and his solutions to Brazil's economic woes, which are not terrible on a global stand, is to deforest the Amazon. He believes the Amazon is there to serve Brazil's economic interests and for nothing else. He doesn't care about climate change. He says it's all a hoax. And so the race is a lot tighter. And he has a trump card in that faction of the army has said that it supports his candidacy. They haven't said that they would try to reverse a loss by the force of arms. But the question then remains, will they hit the streets? Bolsonaro has urged his supporters to hit the streets if the victory is not by a landslide.
Okay, let's look at that. What's your sense of, because Bolsonaro is coming, this is the second runoff, isn't it? And Bolsonaro is coming.
What happened was in the first round, the way the Brazilian presidential elections go, they also had, full slate of congressional elections. And unfortunately there, in the state governorships, the House of Representatives and the Senate, it's almost an even division between pro-Bolsonaro and pro-Lula forces. They have these huge coalitions, multi-party coalitions, 12, 15 parties on each side. I mean, it's amazing. But that's all settled. That's done and dusted. It's going to be, no matter who wins, there's going to be a deadlock Congress, for sure.
So how far behind is Bolsonaro from?
Well, here's what happened.
And if you were looking at the trajectories and getting a sense from afar, what would your view be on the outcome?
Oh, well, that's a good one. I'll just recap what happened. So in the first round on September 27th, under Brazilian law, if you get 50% of the vote plus one, literally one more vote, then you win. You become president. In the first round on September 27th, Lula, who was polling at 51%, and so a lot of us, because I'm on Lula's side, were hoping that he'd win outright. Instead, he got 48%. Worse yet, Bolsonaro, who was polling at 35%, rose to 43% in the popular vote. And so they're a lot closer than one would have expected from the polling. And that tells us a couple of things. The crude measure is that people were lying to pollsters, very much the way people lied to pollsters about Trump. Michael Moore, the filmmaker, had a good line on that. He said, given the social opprobrium attached to voting for Trump in 2016, people just lied. And then they went out and voted for him.
Yeah.
Bolsonaro.
Because it's almost too embarrassing to do so intellectually, and also
exactly.
for your soul, it's kind of wrong, in a sense, especially if God's, in the mix.
Yeah. But again, remember, Trump scratched an ugly itch in the American polity. We have to be clear about that. No one wanted to admit that he was scratching their itch, but they voted for him in the privacy of the polling booth or by mail or however they did it. Bolsonaro's the same thing. The man is a pig. Okay, the man is a terrible human being, but he's appealed to the evangelicals. See, again, in the United States, the GOP, MAGA, appeal to the evangelicals. He's done that. He unbelievably, he loosened Brazilian gun laws 2 months ago. Brazil, as it is an incredibly violent place. Very violent. I can't exaggerate here. Very violent place, and he put more guns out onto the streets. His argument was that if people bought guns, the middle class bought guns, then they could shoot armed intruders who were breaking into their homes at night. That was his justification. There's been a rush on guns in Brazil. Well, he's now telling his followers to hit the streets in the event that he doesn't win by a landslide. And he's saying that anything less than that is evidence of electoral fraud, even though the Brazilian Supreme Court has said there's no evidence of that and that he needs to stop stoking the fires because this is going to cause civil unrest. Well, that's what I think we're going to see. I think we're going to see Lula win, but not by a lot. And and I should point out, one of the disappointing aspects of the first round vote, again, Bolsonaro up to 43%, was that Lula got votes. The majority of the provinces, or the states, that voted for Lula were rural provinces, states.
Yeah.
And that you would have thought, no, they would be more conservative, large landowners.
So why this change there?
Well, this is it. And again, the parallels with Trump and the Tories is remarkable because Bolsonaro got the majority of his support from Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Minas Gerais. This is the industrial belt of Brazil.
Oh, okay.
This is where Lula comes from, a region in the Sao Paulo state called the ABC. It's where auto manufacturing is centered in Brazil. The auto industry is huge in Brazil. A lot of the cars you see in North America are made in Brazil.
Wow.
And Lula was a union organizer. I've met Lula when I was researching a book in the late 80s. I actually met him while he was still a union organizer. He was the head of what they call the CUT. The fact that the majority would not vote for him, even with that strong industrial union present, suggests to me that the elites of the industrial band in Brazil, just like in the case of Trump and Wall Street, they like the fact that Bolsonaro lowered taxes on the rich, expanded loopholes for people to evade taxes, did the things that they like. And even though he's a slimy creature, they'd rather vote for him than vote for a communist. Now Lula's not a communist. He's a social democrat. He gets tarred with that brush, but Let's just say that he's moderated his views a lot since his youthful days in the Union. So the issue here is if you have the middle class and elites of the industrial band in Brazil going for Bolsonaro as the better default option, it's not entirely plausible that Lula might lose. It's very possible that if it gets really tight, uh, Lula might lose. And of course, if it's really tight, then Bolsonaro is going to ratchet up the violent rhetoric. The good thing, I think, is when I was going over all the coalitions, there were 8 or 9 other presidential candidates in the race. And if you think of that 48-43 split in the first round, all those other candidates got washed out. Their votes have to go somewhere. And so it's very possible that the Green Party, the Communist Party, the left parties that got washed out will throw their votes to Lula in a measure that's greater than the religious parties, the gun party, and the right parties that got washed would have. The numbers would seem to favor the left side of the equation. But then we have the issue. So over the short term, will there be violence on the aftermath of the election? My reckoning is yes, there will be. And then B, no matter who wins, there is a deadlocked or stalemated Congress in both houses waiting for them when they finally get through the immediate period after the election. So once again, we see a frustrated public that is willing to listen to demagogic appeals and makes races that should not be tight a lot tighter than they are. And I'll finish with Italy.
I was just going to say, there's the segue to Italy, because this is fascinating from the point of view of outcome and where that vote of a reasonable population, the way they, we've had a number of expressions of right-wing cronyism and corruption, obviously with Berlusconi and others that have been in the mix in the past. But Paul, take us through the extreme situation of which has got huge popular support now in Italy.
Well, what's interesting is that so Italy went hard right, and this new government, the female presidential candidate Giorgia Molinari, I believe her name is, she only won 26% of the vote. Her party did, and they're called Brothers of Italy. They're directly descended from neo-fascist parties that date back to the Mussolini era. I mean, that's their roots are in Mussolini. She's the leader of the biggest, but they only garnered 26% of the vote. So they formed a coalition on the right that includes Berlusconi, includes a guy called Mario Salvieri, I believe his name is, who was, a neo-fascist. And therein lies some very interesting dynamics. First of all, the left was completely fractured and argued more about ideological issues amongst themselves. Who's the better communist? And they went nowhere. They got trounced.
Heard similar arguments on this side of the world as well, Paul.
Yep. How many angels can dance on the head of a leftist pin?
Yeah.
So the infighting killed them off. The center, which was run by technocrats under the previous president, which was very EU focused, very moderate in many things, did not appeal to Italians because it failed to do something that, again, an itch that needed to be scratched was curb immigration.
Okay.
Immigration's become, in Italy, the same problem it is in the United States. In fact, if you look throughout Europe, all right-wing parties are anti-immigration. Now, it turns out that is this woman's particular concern is stopping illegal immigration from Africa, Middle East and Africa. But it goes further than that because Berlusconi, his allies, and Salvieri, if I got the name correct, they're pro-Putin. They don't want Italy to be involved in supporting the Ukraine. Molinari is pro-Ukraine, but she's got a coalition with pro-Russian leaders. Again, Berlusconi, a former PM. And given that her party only won 29% of the vote, 26% of the vote, and these other guys won even less,
Mm.
the possibility is very real that they're going to fracture within 6 months, and they're going to fracture over things like supporting the Ukraine. But she scratched that itch. In Italy, it happened to be about dark skinned immigrants, overwhelming. And the language was the same. They're taking away our culture, our way of life is being threatened, the usual la. So I don't necessarily think that the shift to the right is going to be as profound as many of those on the right think it will be, because I don't think they're going to last. Most Italians, from the public opinion polls, assuming they're not lying, are pro-Ukraine, overwhelmingly so. But these right-wing parties with their neo-Nazi, neo-fascist elements are agitating for NATO to stay out.
So what about the polls that are coming out of Italy that are saying the popular support for this coalition of the right, and including the extreme right that you're referring to here, is quite supportive? Now, how do we make sense of that?
Well, I think that it finally came down to one fundamental issue, which is, given that all other options had failed, including the technocratic moderate option that had immediately preceded this election, why not let the right have a go at it?
Yeah, so this is the same sentiment that you're kicking into, the era of restive politics. So it's outside of ideology, again, like we entered into this program on, and it's a response to dissatisfaction and the authoritarian governance of any incumbent.
Yeah, I mean, Molinari is basically replicating what Marie Le Pen did in France. Le Pen got the second highest amount of votes in the last French election for president.
I think it scared people on the left to actually go with the more moderate Macron, didn't it? It was a recipe basically to win.
No, good point. I mean, in France it did. But in Italy, I mean, they've had left-center governments. They've had these technocratic governments. And yet the public is still disgruntled. And they're just not getting what they want out of government. For better or worse, right or wrong. And so I think they just decided, you know what? Let's give the right a shot.
So just on that, before we dig into the Berlusconi influences there, is this whole situation here an issue of the population no longer being sensitive to cause effect and the variations of solution? And if it is disconnected from that, meaning for the common good as part of solution, the cause-effect solution type methodologies of politics, and if that's the case, if there's a disassociation or a desensitization, they're not interested in that type of thing, what would bring them back to that, which arguably could bring a more hands-on interventionist response from an incumbent government via the polling booth?
Well, it's hard to answer, because in Italy, and in fact around the world, I mean, part of this restive politics is that politics has become what is known as an impossible game, in the sense that any measure you take that wins approval of certain sectors of the population. So let's say if you do student debt relief, there will be an equally strong sector of the population that vehemently opposes it and will do everything to have it overruled, changed, or whatnot. Everything's become, stalemated. And that's, again, the demagoguery comes in, because if you can then work on racial stereotypes, if you can work the sort of hidden fractures of society and say it's the immigrants' fault or it's these guys' fault and this, that, and the other, then you're in a logjam. You're locked into it. And quite frankly, maybe you could forge grand coalitions and just find a common sense, common core of policy objectives that both the right and the left could accept. But remember, we're talking about, here in New Zealand, we talk about it, and in the States, it's very obvious, the lack of civic virtue. We don't teach civics in high school, certainly not in primary school. the fact that many people don't understand what democracy entails, that democracy is a compromise. You don't get everything you want all of the time. In fact, you get a little bit of what you want some of the time. People don't, people in advanced liberal democracies with long histories of democratic governments no longer comprehend what a democracy really is. It's all about my rights and not about my responsibilities. This is a global malaise. And it's in that mix where people start getting restive. They don't temper their expectations because they don't realize that democratic governance is essentially one iterative, if not extensive form, compromise game. You compromise on this, and then you compromise on that. Some are, some policy compromises swing to the left, some to the right. I think that, a civic education is at the core of this, how we possibly can restore some measure of civic education and then get people to understand the limitations of governance in order to not expect too much, but expect competence where governance is necessary. That's the task ahead, I think, for liberal democracies. Now, the good news, I guess, is we've talked about a lot of bad things happening in 4 liberal democracies that have undergone or are undergoing, political change or electoral change. The good news from my perspective is that authoritarian regimes are not immune to
Yeah,
the
so we're
same.
going to, you're going to pick up the China issue here and the CCP's conventions of most recent weeks. Now, that illustrates the point that you've been arguing persuasively as you go through this to the listeners, you check this out, because this is not tied to just liberal democracies and how the expression of the popular or cumulative wish of the peoples is expressed in their choice of party and government. This is right around the world in some of the biggest holdings, if you like, of the global population. Paul, over to you about the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, the thing is, again, it's a crisis of governance. I mean, you can have good authoritarian regimes, such as the soft authoritarian one-party state in Singapore. People are generally content in Singapore, even though it's authoritarian. It just is. On the other hand, before we get to the CCP, let's take Iran. Clearly now, the demonstrations in Iran are not just about a murdered woman who was taken by the morality police because she didn't wear a hijab. Apparently, she was Kurdish to boot. That was the precipitating event. And to their credit, it was young women who decided they'd have enough. But it's morphed into socioeconomic demonstrations. I mean, these have grown a lot larger than the question of whether or not women should wear hijabs. That in turn tells us that even with the repressive apparatus as strong as it is, the Iranian regime is not delivering on the basic goods that otherwise would keep people content. They are annoyed because of the incompetence. Too much talk about Israel, too much saber rattling around the regime with the Revolutionary Guard, and not enough attention to the problems at home. And we just saw an explosion at a Shia shrine. Now things are getting quite interesting, because that means if the fingers are pointing in every which direction, and it's unclear who committed the crime, but if it represents an ethnic crime, that is a Sunni minority decided to do this in southern Iran, where there are Sunni minorities, this could really blow. I mean,
if it's found to have external influences or even operational expertise, of which the region it's certainly got its fingerprint on such things in different times, then it's another can of worms that will explode in everyone's faces.
I mean, I don't even want to think of the possibilities of who might be involved. But the issue, I think, is that the Iranian regime has, since the revolution, has been pretty good at projecting a vision of itself as radical in a theocratic sense, but competent. that, this is a very big country. It could potentially be a great power. But they were running the show pretty well. Now they've been exposed to being incompetent, or at least this latest administration. And the protests have gone way beyond morality. I mean, they're into very basic socioeconomic issues. So they've got a problem that is replicated in a number of other countries, to include Turkey, which is in the middle of an economic crisis, and Erdogan. He's going into religion. The more fundamentalist he goes, the more backward Turkey goes. You're not going to become a great power being a fundamentalist Islamic state, which is where he appears to be headed. Russia, of course, as we've talked at great length, this war is evidence of Russian decline and maladministration. It's a kleptocracy. And now it's being exposed as such because it's not prosecuting the war in a competent manner. Again, basic military competence is lacking. And that leads me to turn to the CCP, because there's some interesting things going on in China. You and I have talked about this, but I think our listeners may not have been as attuned as we have been to the following. So we had the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. They're held every 5 years. And under the previous constitutions, which was changed by Xi Jinping in 2018, prior to 2018, the Secretary General of the Communist Party and the President of China served 2 terms, a maximum of 2 terms, and then they retired. He changed the constitution, so now he can run for unlimited terms, and lo and behold, he was just rewarded with his 3rd term. But not all is well under Xi Jinping in the CCP. And strangely enough, he demonstrated it. It wasn't, someone unfurling a banner, although there were protests in Beijing during the Congress. People did unfurl protest banners on bridges. I mean, that's unheard of. But here's what happened. The whole thing is a choreographed spectacle. Okay, it's designed to look good. It's designed to offer a show of unity.
Yeah, no surprises.
No surprises. Okay, so, but what we see is the following. On one day, the previous president of China, the previous Secretary General, the guy immediately before Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, I believe his name is, he is unceremoniously escorted off the main stage, literally picked up by 2 aides, and marched, more or less frog marched, stage left. The CCP put out a release and said he was in ill health, but no China watcher believes that for a second. What that was, and he was sitting right next to Xi, was Xi's way of showing that the moderates were finished. He was killing off their leader symbolically by removing him from the center stage. Then it was a message to everybody in that hall that the reformist moderate days were over. Okay, we get that, okay, because Xi has been increasingly authoritarian throughout his tenure. So no surprises there that he would remove a rival. It was unceremonious. It was vulgar that he would remove him. It reminded me of that very infamous episode in Iraqi politics, where Saddam Hussein summoned the leaders of the Ba'athist Party of Iraq, the party he led, to a theater in Baghdad. And after he got them all assembled, he proceeded to point out various individuals and called them traitors and Israeli spies and whatnot. And they were marched out of the theater and shot. They didn't make it 100 meters out of that theater before they were executed. Well, Saddam Hussein was, just a thug. Xi Jinping is not a thug, but it was on that order. Okay, just marching this other guy off.
The symbolism's the same, is what you're saying there, as opposed to the brutal, gross expression of that. You know, Xi doesn't need to do a Stalin approach here. The political apparatus picks up the signals, and that does the job. Yeah.
Right. There's, you know, again, this wasn't very nuanced, but compared to Saddam. But here's the more important thing, Selwyn. And again, I know you're aware of a lot of this. Then they announced the Politburo. Those are 35 people, I believe, and the standing committee of the Politburo, which are 7 people, including the Secretary General of the Communist Party, Xi himself. So 6 other fellows. What was interesting about that is, for the first time in 20 years, there were no women. In fact, there are no women in the Politburo. And that's odd because Xi has been he's put out a book called, you know, Xi Jinping Thought. It's like Mao's little red book.
Yep.
And in it, he keeps on talking about traditional gender roles, traditional values that husbands need to lead their families, that Chinese men are getting too soft. You know, he and Tucker Carlson need to have a talk about manliness. It's, you know, it's a little weird. But that's not the most important of the changes. All 6 people in the standing committee and the Politburo at large are all Xi loyalists. Okay, they are hardliners who support him unequivocally. That's the sign of weakness for 2 reasons.
Choose your sycophants.
Yeah, well, okay, and so let's explain the 2 reasons. You know, in proper order. The first one is, if you got a bunch of yes men, because this is what these people are, you have an echo chamber. You don't have feedback loops. I mean, the external backdrop to the party Congress is that things are not going well in China. The pandemic response has been disastrous in some places, specifically Shanghai. The economy is slowing down. The estimate is it will grow at around 6% this year, which is a rebound from last year, but nowhere near the heights of 9%, 12% of previous decades. And that growth is heavily concentrated in places that have managed to avoid the pandemic. Civil unrest is starting to emerge. There's a whole movement now of graffiti artists graffitiing public facilities with very anti-Xi personal messages. So discontent is out there. His response is to bring in these yes men. That's not a feedback loop. That's, you know, he's not going to be able to read, you know, the mood of the people.
So let's do a comparison. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Well,
let's do
let me do the last thing, because then I'm sure you'll be able to add to it. So there's that, right? He now no longer has a feedback loop. And you may remember me saying that my father had this line. He was, you know, again, he was a personal friend of General Pinochet in Chile, but understood, you know, that was a business proposition between him and Pinochet. But he used to say, when the general starts wearing capes, he is soon to fall. And he wasn't just referring to the fact that Pinochet had taken to wearing these big white capes, sort of looked like Elvis, and he looked ridiculous. And so my father's point was, no one surrounding him is telling him that he looks ridiculous. So how could he gauge the mood of the people? And he was absolutely right. Well, the same thing will happen here, in that Xi is not getting proper feedback. What he's getting is people saying, yes, you're right. Absolutely. Let's continue to do this. That would be a problem in and of itself, but then it's compounded by another one. And this is killer. He didn't name a successor because he now has an open-ended, you know, constitutional fiat to keep on being the president. The fundamental problem of all authoritarian regimes, all of them, is the question of succession. One-party states, the party is the succession vehicle. You work your way up the ranks, you become Secretary General, and the number 2 guy replaces you at a certain time. In dynastic regimes, it's usually the son. The trouble is, most of these dynasties suffer from what is known as the universal law of genetic decline. The son is not as smart as the dad, and the grandson is an idiot. And so they tend to peter out over time. Well, he's just cut off an avenue of succession within the CCP. You can work hard to be number two, but unless you kiss his rear, you're never going to get to be the big boss.
And it's left to speculation at best. And there's been some speculation, I guess, from The Economist, the Financial Times, those that have a vested interest in trying to unpick long-term trends. But there's unsurety and subjectivism around that, isn't there? And this is the big problem that, should the subjectivism actually get some meat around it and become less subjective in the analysis of who could be a possible successor, the risks to that individual elevate in this type of environment, even if the leader doesn't necessarily give the Saddam Hussein push on the button.
Well, yeah, I mean, think of it this way. It's good for us as outsiders to speculate, right? But what really matters is the interaction between those 6 members of the standing committee who are not Xi. They're now looking at each other with the side eye, because it's going to be one of them who becomes the successor sooner or later, or maybe not. They may be replaced before Xi decides to go. But this opens a can of worms for the CCP, because now there's no clean line by which you can rotate cadres to top leadership positions. It's all up to this one guy.
Okay, so my question on this is a comparative exercise, Paul. It seems to me that what Xi is doing here is he's creating a bridge back to Mao. That there is all of the other leaders between Mao and himself, in a sense, are no longer relevant. That there's a return to some of the Maoist type of principles of centralized leadership. Can you do a comparison of the two, whether it be cultural, or ideologically based, or even pragmatically within a Chinese People's Republic of China context? And also, where would you feel it will end along that timeline going forward, given historical? What does it mean for a line in the sand of a generational shift once Xi does go?
Well, it is a good comparison, and I'll start with the personal motivations that may be behind this. Xi Jinping was the son of a Maoist party official, a party official who was purged in the Cultural Revolution, and Xi himself was sent to a re-education camp because of the sins of his father, apparently. What we appear to be seeing here is he wants to return to a state-centered ideological view of a homogeneous Han-dominated China. Much in the way Vladimir Putin harks back to the days of empire and the Russian Empire, so too Xi is harking back to the days of unity, harmony, traditional values. You see, both of those authoritarians believe that Western democracy is a direct threat to their cultures, that the influence of the liberal West, let's say with gay rights and those sort of things, are poisonous for the traditional cultures of both countries. So they're doing more or less the same thing. Now, what's interesting about Xi, he is not going back to a command economy. He's going back to a stronger state capitalist economy. He's already put restrictions on foreign businesses operating in China. He's put tremendous restrictions on the telecommunications sector. And we know that Huawei is essentially a front for Chinese intelligence. I mean, that's where the fusion is the most obvious and the deepest. But what he's doing is causing alarm, because a capital flight out of China in the last year and a half by foreign businesses who see the restrictions coming has accelerated dramatically. People are moving their assets to Singapore. Hong Kong used to be a safe haven, but it no longer is. They're moving assets to Taiwan, of all places, because they believe that if they bolster the Taiwanese economy, then the Chinese will be much more reluctant to take it out via armed force. So he's moving to reassert state control over economic matters, but also over cultural matters. Right? They don't like. I mean, he said things. He doesn't like seeing men wear shorts. I mean, this is how grassroots level his vision is, and the fact that he will not name a successor in advance so as to smooth the transition down the road, because he's no spring chicken. He's older than I am, and which means he's I think he's 72. So yeah, he might get another 5-year term, but it just seems like an awkward, if not counterproductive mood. But it's because he wants to cement his vision of the proper Chinese society, and those days are over. You can't return to Mao because a lot of time has passed, and a lot of things have changed in China. You have a domestic bourgeoisie. They like their cars. They like their Hermes, tote bags. And so this sort of regression towards a harder type of authoritarianism that is more inflexible, not flexible, but inflexible on cultural grounds, I'll tell you, it augurs poorly for Xi's permanence in power and for the CCP, because there's going to be infighting. If the knives aren't out already, which I believe they are, within that larger Politburo and then within the Congress itself, they will be over the next coming years, particularly if one thing happens. Another axiom, so just as I said, the axiom in comparative politics is that the problem of succession, the question of succession, is the Achilles heel of authoritarian regimes. They've got to solve it institutionally. If they don't, they fall. The other one is when authoritarians are confronted with domestic instability and domestic unrest, what do? They start a foreign war. They pick on a smaller adversary, try to wrap themselves in patriotism and nationalism and all of that, and they go sick on, someone who looks smaller and thus vulnerable. And you know what? It turns out, more often than not, they fail. They fail for a variety of reasons, again, military incompetence, but also the international community does not like to see someone pick on a smaller neighbor just because they're having troubles at home. And so the whole issue of Taiwan can be framed in that way and say, this is Xi's foreign diversion. He's going to go for it if there's a lot of domestic unrest. Well, as I said, students of comparative politics will tell you they fail more often than not just because the country that's being attacked tends to fight back a lot better than the aggressor would imagine, but also the international community backs the country that's been attacked. And in the case of Taiwan, Taiwan has informal security agreements, not just with the United States, but with its neighbors, because they see it as a domino theory in reverse. If the Chinese can successfully attack and occupy Taiwan, then what's it to stop? What would stop it from continuing further down in the South China Sea? So all of this is to say that there are restive politics in China that are now seeping upwards into pressures on the CCP leadership, and they're not responding competently. This whole show, especially the end, is if I was pro Xi, I would find it alarming. I would say he's starting to crack because he's not doing the simple things that would relieve the pressures on the top leadership. And remember, he's being held personally responsible for the debacle of the pandemic response. He's going with that zero COVID policy. It's not working. Shanghai is operating at 60% of capacity. There's a lot wrong with their approach, but now it's a matter of saving face. He won't change because, he feels it'll make him look bad. He looks bad anyway. So I think what we're seeing is in China, the first manifestations of fissures in the facade, to coin a phrase. And in that sense, it's a particularly Chinese version of the larger malaise that we've been describing around the world. And I think you made the really good point. The point of the day was that this this disgruntlement, this restiveness is not ideological. Okay, it's material, it's practical, but it's not driven by the usual ideological wedges. And here's the kicker. I'll leave you with this thought. The kicker here is that we haven't even mentioned climate change. You the fundamental policy issue confronting all regimes today, which some acknowledge and some do not, is climate change. And how regimes respond to climate change will be their making or breaking. I think that as the evidence of coastal warming and that sort of thing goes on, it's going to break one way or another. And this is what was interesting to me with regards to all of these elections. In the United States midterm elections, climate change is never mentioned. It's not a subject. In Brazil, which is exposed to global warming in a major way, not mentioned at all. In Italy, not mentioned. In the Tory leadership battle, nada. I mean, nothing. The biggest policy challenge confronting the world is not being mentioned by anybody when it comes to the politics of the day. It was not mentioned by the CCP. It's not being mentioned by the Iranians. I think we're going to see in the next few years that'll be the litmus test on who survives as a form of governments and who does not.
Fascinating. I put an underscore line under that too, Paul. I support that view. Now, just before we do move on, we'll close the program with a series of comments and a couple of questions that have come in that have been answered. But I'll centre in because on David Mooring's contributions at the exclusion of others, because I think he's been really into this issue the most. Anyway, I'll just bring them up on screen, and for those that are listening to this, I'll read them out. David Mooring, he puts in here, the rise of the alt-right reality denying political movements is almost a criminal failure of the news media. Fox News and their ilk are a clear and present danger to democracy and should be treated as such. Now, David was referring to at that juncture of a discussion that we were having about the disregard that the voting publics in some jurisdictions are having with respect to good quality governance. He goes a little bit further here again. He says here, actually what I do like is this bit here, David. I'll just bring this up. The journalist, David Mooring says here, and it's Article 5 or Chapter 5 of the Code of Ethics that he's referring to here, the journalist shall do the utmost to rectify any published information which is found to be harmfully inaccurate. And that's from the Declaration of Principles on the Conduct of Journalists, which was decided and agreed upon at Bordeaux in 1954. Now, he ties the purpose of that comment up with this last one, and cheers to you for that. He says, is the majority of people as disgruntled as claimed, or is it very vocal minority over an amplified Facebook? And he says basically that he goes on to say that journalists, it's almost a crime when you sit back and support disinformation, misinformation, knowingly so, in an environment of such fundamental importance. And I just thought there was a lot of thinking in there and a lot of discussion that could have, but the questions that were interwoven with those comments have been answered during the program, and I thank people for their interactions on that, and also for the thumbs up that we're getting from various platforms.
Yeah, let me just say one thing in response to David. I couldn't agree with you more, David, but there's two aspects to it. The media has become more ideological. Well, even before I get to that, with regards to whether it's a very vocal minority or it's the majority, look at the voting turnout records of these recent elections. They were extremely low. The United States will probably be pretty high, but in Italy and in Brazil, they were actually quite low. Now, this second round in Brazil may be high, but I think that's emblematic of the fact that a lot of people are restive and disgruntled. Now, with regards to the media, decisions have been made in the past 20 years be it by Rupert Murdoch, or other media magnates, to take ideological positions. And, they're absolutely cancer on journalistic integrity. You mentioned Fox News. Again, I couldn't agree more. But there's another aspect to it, and it's technologically driven. Uh, Clickbait, sensational headlines, stuff that's, reality TV inspired, personality, scandal, this, that, and the other, that drives eyeballs onto screens. And the more you click, the more advertising revenue
Yeah.
you accrue.
So
So, and here, let me give you an example. Yesterday, I got a call from a quote unquote journalist who wanted to interview me about two rich New Zealanders who, contrary to the warnings of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other travelers, ventured into Iran by land and were detained. Now, they were not in prison, but they spent 4 months sorting things out with the help of a very small New Zealand embassy in Tehran. And this became, once they've been out now for a while, but it filtered back home, these people call themselves influencers. They're just two punk rich kids driving around the world in a very expensive four-wheel drive. But these influencers then released the news that they were detained for 4 months in Iran. People jump on the anti-Iran bandwagon. The media goes crazy. And they wanted me to comment on the plight of these people. And I said to the journalist, you must be joking. This is not a serious matter of foreign policy and international relations. A better suited person for this story is a gossip columnist or a social media influencer.
So my point on all of this, Paul, is I agree with everything you've said, and there's an extension to this that's highly relevant in my view from a media point of view. That what we've seen is media in general, particularly those dominant mainstream media, and there are exceptions to the contrary here, but have pushed public interest elements or persuasions to the side. And they will only pick those up when the commoditization of those influences or those decisions can be asserted. And you see it from the point of view, you may get Paula Penfold or someone like that does an amazing job on revealing something significant that is integral to the national and or public interest. You'll see the opposing media choose to exclude unless they can get some sort of angle that will discredit and destroy their media opposition's public interest expression, or get an angle that populates clickbait as a response on top of to take away that response from the public to the main opposition medias. The commoditization of the news is, in my view, one of the fundamental breakdowns in the quality of its product and service. But I'll just leave that out there for others to pick over the bones of that. Paul, it's been a long one, but it was, like you said before we went on air, this is like around the world in 90 days. And we did it in about an hour and 10 minutes or so. So, salute to you on that one. And I'll look forward to the next episode of A View from Afar. This is series number 3, so the 3rd year we've been running, and it's episode 20 in 2022. So we're doing pretty well there and keeping this up. Paul, thanks for that, and salute to you for that as well. Those who may wish to join us, we intend to be back this time, or midday on Thursday, New Zealand time next week, which is Wednesday around 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time in the United States. And we will once again be recording this live, and interaction's always welcome. Until that time, thank you, ka kite anō, and we'll see you again in the future. Goodbye.